Mr President, I rise to make a contribution on the Electoral Funding Bill 2018, and I indicate from the outset that Labor will be opposing this bill. This bill will replace the existing 1981 legislation and seeks to implement the 2015 expert panel report into donations. An expert panel, it should be remembered, that was convened by then Premier Baird to address the endemic corruption that had been exposed within the Liberal Party. Some of these recommendations were introduced in legislation in time for the 2015 election. After the election, the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters, of which I am a member, conducted an inquiry into its implementation. But, Mr President, we will be opposing this bill because of the key issue of third-party campaigners. We oppose this bill because it represents an attack on the way that we, as the Labor Party and the Labor movement, organise in a collectivist manner. And, Mr President, I wish to address the comments of the previous speaker, the Honourable Dr Peter Phelps, who spoke of the collusion between the Labor Party and the trade union movement. Mr President, this is not a financial market. These are political parties. It is a fundamentally different environment in which we organise on political issues. We campaign on political issues. And it is true that the great trade union movement formed at the wonderful Labor Party 127 years ago. But let it be noted in this chamber that there have been points in our history where we have disagreed with each other. We fundamentally believe in the right of working people. We fundamentally advocate for the rights of working people. But there is no doubt that occasionally the political arm of the trade union movement and the interests of individual trade unions don't always match up. And trade unions should be allowed the opportunity to advocate for their members, whether those interests line up with the Labor Party or not. Now, Mr Deputy President, this bill seeks to reduce the amount of money that third-party campaigners can reduce by more than half to $500,000. Mr President, the Joint Standing Committee, in its report on implementing the SHOT report, said before implementing such a reduction in this expenditure limit, that the government should investigate whether there is sufficient evidence that a third-party campaigner could reasonably present its case within this expenditure limit. Mr President, let's consider the broader context to this. There are 5 million electors. There were 5 million electors in 2015. With a $500,000 cap, that means there is merely 10 cents per elector that allows third parties to communicate with those individuals. This is at a time when a postage stamp costs $1 at least, and we are in Sydney one of the most, if not the most, expensive TV media market in the country. There is no doubt that on top of that, compliance costs and the complexity of the legislation require third-party campaigners to undertake extensive compliance measures. A cap of $500,000 will not allow them to communicate with the broader public in a meaningful way. Now, let me be clear, I support caps on donations and expenditure, but elections must not be cloaked in bureaucracy. The principle must be to allow citizens to participate in the political process in a fair and transparent way. There is no way that the average community group can now comply with this legislation, and nor would they be encouraged to by provisions such as those that prevent them from acting in concert in even the most informal of ways. This clause of the bill that seeks to make it illegal for third parties to collaborate is a fundamental attack on the way the Labor movement has operated since its inception and has been part of the Labor Party since its formation 127 years ago. This is just the latest attack on the Labor movement's political participation. A previous attempt by then Premier O'Farrell in 2012 to limit donations only to individuals on the electoral roll was struck down by the High Court in 2013. I am encouraged by the fact that unions have already indicated that if this legislation is passed, they will challenge it in the High Court. Indeed, let it be noted, Mr. President, that the measures in this bill designed to prevent third parties acting in concert were based on the ACT legislation that their government repealed as a result of that 2013 High Court decision. This is just the latest attempt to silence their opposition. Mr. President, there are a range of measures in the bill that will increase transparency around electoral funding in New South Wales. We do agree that the 1981 legislation could benefit from a comprehensive rewrite. But, Mr. President, many of the measures in this bill are either building on Labor's policy on that historic and fundamental change that was made when caps and donations were introduced by the Labor government in 2010, or indeed implement Labor policy that we have been campaigning on for the last several years. The real-time public disclosure of political donations is a key aspect of this bill, but the Labor Party campaign, our leader Luke Foley announced this in 2016, and New South Wales Labor already makes these disclosures weekly. The caps on electoral and expenditure and donations for both state and local government elections, which, as I said, were introduced by the Labor Party in 2010 in government, will now be extended to local government elections, indeed in somewhat of a haphazard manner, and I think we'll deal with those in the Committee of the Whole. I do welcome the increasing the governance measures on political parties while still allowing for their own unique organisations. Mr. President, let me make this point. Political parties are not corporations. Political parties each have their own unique histories and each organise in their own unique ways. It is a fine line to walk in our legislation to allow an appropriate and best practice governance procedures to be in place, but yet to allow each party to implement those appropriately for their political organisation. And I do believe that we have, with a few exceptions, managed to walk that fine line in this bill tonight. We will ensure, importantly, that senior office holders in political parties will be accountable for breaches of the Act. And subsequently will increase the penalties for breaches of the Act. Mr. Deputy President, I also welcome the provision that the Electoral Commission will be required to provide training for candidates, for political parties, for members of Parliament and third-party campaigners to understand their extensive obligations under this Act. And I welcome the provisions to refine, after 8 years in operation, the requirements around indirect donations and requiring disclosures only to be audited once. Mr. President, I wish to also address the role of the New South Wales Electoral Commission in my comments tonight, because we have one of the best electoral systems in the world, and a fundamental aspect of that is the independence of the New South Wales Electoral Commission. But there are some provisions in this bill that, and this is something that we have discussed extensively at a joint standing committee level, that the role of the Electoral Commission must not be in approval of political parties. It must not delve into political parties, that this bracket or perhaps mission creep of the Electoral Commission must be very carefully guarded against. We must ensure that they provide best practice governance advice to parties, that they are the registration body and the governance body, but that this regulatory role is not overstepped. And to effect that change, the Labor Party will be moving, I will foreshadow that we will be moving amendments in the Committee of the Whole to prevent the Electoral Commission from being required to provide explanation and analysis of political donations on their website. This is not an appropriate use of an independent commission body's time. They should be providing the information to the public, who can make their own analysis and their own judgments on that information. Mr. President, parts of this legislation are welcomed, but this legislation has been hastily written and is being rushed through the Parliament this evening. Just one example of this is that instead of the usual combined party and candidate total, independent candidates will have an arbitrary $200 less to spend than that combined total. A simple oversight that reveals a lack of care in preparing the bill. Now, this is usually an area where we can collaborate. This is usually an area where we can determine the fair goalposts that elections should be fought upon. But the dirty tricks in this legislation make it impossible. The government is seeking to rig the playing field by fundamentally changing the electoral system in New South Wales, and our colleagues in the Labor movement will challenge it in the courts. But whether that challenge is finalised in time for the election or not, it doesn't matter, because we're coming for you, and the public are onto you. And to those opposite, enjoy your last 10 months on the Treasury benches. To the crossbench, don't get dragged down with these guys. Oppose the bill.